Breaking news shook both the United States and Cuba. On September 26, 2025, Assata Shakur, once branded America's most dangerous woman, died in Havana at the age of 78. For more than 4 decades, she was one of the most wanted fugitives in U.S. history. To law enforcement, she was a convicted murderer, a terrorist, and a symbol of violent extremism. To her supporters, she was a political prisoner, a revolutionary who stood up against an oppressive system, and a survivor of one of the most turbulent chapters in American history. Her story raises a haunting question. Who was Assata Shakur really? Was she the ruthless cop killer described in court documents and FBI posters? Or was she the victim of a political witch hunt, framed, persecuted, and forced into exile? To answer that question, we must travel back to the 1940s, to the childhood of a girl born JoAnn Deborah Byron, long before she took the name that would make her infamous. Because to understand her death, we must first confront her life. JoAnn Deborah Byron was born on July 16, 1947, in Jamaica, Queens, New York City. Her life began in the shadows of a segregated America, where the promises of freedom and equality rang hollow for millions of black families. Her childhood was marked by instability. When her parents' marriage fell apart, JoAnn was sent back and forth between relatives in New York and North Carolina. In the Jim Crow South, she saw firsthand the ugliness of racial discrimination. White-only water fountains, segregated buses, schools where black children were told they would never succeed. These weren't just rules of society. They were daily reminders of where she stood in America's racial hierarchy. By her teenage years, JoAnn had grown restless. She wanted more than survival. She wanted change. She immersed herself in books, poetry, and debates about black identity. Friends describe her as sharp, fiery, and unwilling to back down. After high school, she attended the borough of Manhattan Community College, and later, the City College of New York. It was here, in the late 1960s, that she encountered a new wave of political thought sweeping through campuses across the nation. The civil rights movement of the early 60s had opened doors, but the rise of the Black Power movement challenged young people to demand more. JoAnn began attending rallies, protests, and community organizing meetings. She was deeply moved by activists who argued that peaceful protest was no longer enough, that self-defense and radical change were necessary in the face of systemic oppression. She soon took on a new identity, one that reflected her growing political consciousness. Inspired by the African liberation struggles, she renamed herself Assata Shakur. The name meant she who struggles, and the thankful one. It was more than symbolism. It was a declaration that she was leaving behind a life of JoAnn Byron and stepping fully into the fight for black liberation. But that fight would lead her far beyond the college campus, and it would soon entangle her in one of the most controversial organizations of the 20th century, the Black Panther Party. By the late 1960s, the struggle for civil rights had entered a new, more volatile stage. Across America, frustration simmered. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in 1968. The Vietnam War raged on, with young black men drafted to fight overseas, while their own communities suffered poverty and police brutality at home. For Assata Shakur, the question was no longer whether change was needed, but how far one was willing to go to achieve it. She joined the Black Panther Party, drawn by its fiery leaders, its community programs, and its uncompromising stance against racial injustice. In the Panthers, she found a cause that married action with ideology. Free breakfast programs for children, health clinics for poor, but also armed patrols to monitor police. But inside the Panthers, Assata grew disillusioned. Internal conflicts, sexism within the movement, and relentless pressure from the FBI's COINTELPRO program weakened the organization. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was the FBI's secret campaign to infiltrate, disrupt, and destroy radical groups. The Black Panthers were its prime target. Leaders were arrested, exiled, or killed. Amid this storm, Assata shifted toward a more militant offshoot, the Black Liberation Army. Unlike the Panthers' public activism, the BLA operated underground. They believed the United States was at war with black people, and war demanded armed resistance. The BLA carried out bank robberies, prison breaks, and violent shootouts with police. To law enforcement, they were nothing more than domestic terrorists. To their supporters, they were soldiers in a guerrilla war against oppression. Assata quickly became one of the most visible women associated with the BLA. She moved in safe houses, used aliases, and lived a life on the run. FBI posters declared her armed and dangerous. Yet, Assata herself often claimed she wasn't a violent figure portrayed by the media. She said she was targeted not for crimes, but for her politics. Still, by 1972, her name was linked to a string of incidents, including bank robberies and armed confrontations with police. This escalating tension would come to a head one spring night in 1973 on a stretch of the New Jersey Turnpike, a traffic stop that ended in gunfire and would change Assata Shakur's life forever. It was the night of May 2nd, 1973. On the New Jersey Turnpike, State Troopers James Harper and Werner Forster noticed a white Pontiac with mismatched plates. Inside were three people: Assata Shakur, Zaid Shakur, no relation, and Sundiata Ackley, a fellow Black Liberation Army member. The troopers pulled them over. What happened next remains one of the most debated events in modern American history. According to police, as they began questioning the passengers, Assata and her companions opened fire. Trooper James Harper was wounded. Trooper Werner Forster was shot and killed, execution style, with his own service weapon. Zaid Shakur was also killed in the exchange. But Assata's version was very different. She claimed she raised her hands in surrender when the troopers ordered them out of the car. She insisted she never fired a shot. During the chaos, she was struck twice by bullets, one tearing through her shoulder, another lodging in her arm, before collapsing on the pavement. Forensics later confirmed she was badly wounded when apprehended. Yet, prosecutors maintained she had fired the fatal shots that killed Trooper Forster. The images that followed were seared into the public's mind. The mugshot of a young black woman, wounded, handcuffed to a hospital bed, accused of murdering a state trooper. To many Americans, she was a monster. To others, a symbol of how far the government would go to criminalize black resistance. The trial that followed would become a battle not just over guilt and innocence, but over the very soul of American justice. Assata Shakur was rushed from the scene, bleeding heavily from her wounds. In the hospital, she was chained to her bed, surrounded by armed guards. Even as she struggled to breathe, she was charged with the most serious crime imaginable, the murder of a New Jersey state trooper. But this wasn't her first time in custody. By 1973, Assata had already faced 7 separate indictments for alleged armed robberies, bank heists, and kidnappings, charges she always denied. Yet in each of those cases, juries acquitted her or the charges were dismissed. This time, however, the state was determined. The death of Trooper Werner Forster had enraged law enforcement. Headlines branded Assata as the female face of black terror. Prosecutors vowed she would pay. The trial began in 1976 in Middlesex County, New Jersey. The courtroom was tense, lined with police officers. Every day, reporters packed the benches, waiting to capture her downfall. Prosecutors painted her as a ruthless killer who fired point-blank into Forster's chest. They displayed graphic images of the slain trooper's uniform, stained with blood. They called witnesses to testify that she had been part of a revolutionary cell intent on waging war against America itself. But the defense fought back. They argued the evidence didn't match the story. Forensic experts revealed that Assata's injuries made it nearly impossible for her to have fired a weapon that night. Ballistics showed Forster had been killed with his own gun, not one linked directly to her. And jurors heard her repeated statement, "I did not shoot anyone. I was shot with my hands in the air." Still, the tide of emotion was against her. The murder of a state trooper carried immense weight, especially in the 1970s, when the country was reeling from riots, protests, and political assassinations. On March 25, 1977, the verdict was delivered. Assata Shakur was found guilty of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, assault, and armed robbery. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 33 years. The courtroom erupted, some in applause, others in rage. For the state, justice had been served. For her supporters, it was proof that a black woman who dared to resist would never receive a fair trial in America. And behind prison walls, Assata began to plot her next move. one that would stun the world. Prison life for Assata Shakur was harsh, isolating, and relentless. After her 1977 conviction, she was sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. But she wasn't treated like any other inmate. Assata was kept under constant surveillance. Armed guards watched her every move. She was often confined to her cell for 23 hours a day. Visitors were heavily monitored, her mail censored. Authorities feared that her presence behind bars could inspire rebellion, and they intended to silence her. But prison walls could not break her spirit. She began writing letters, essays, and reflections on her life, race in America, and what she described as the state's attempt to crush her. Those writings would later form the foundation of her memoir, Assata. Despite the isolation, her supporters on the outside grew stronger. Activists, writers, and members of the black community rallied to her cause. To them, Assata was a convicted murderer. She was a political prisoner, a woman being punished for her beliefs rather than her actions. By 1979, whispers of escape began circulating, and in November of that year, those whispers became reality. On a cold Sunday afternoon, 3 members of the Black Liberation Army entered the Clinton Correctional Facility armed with concealed weapons. They stormed the visiting room, overpowered the guards, and took hostages. In the chaos, Assata was ushered out, rushed into a waiting van, and vanished into the night. The entire operation took just under 10 minutes. By the time state troopers flooded the prison, Assata was gone. The escape sent shockwaves across the nation. Law enforcement agencies launched one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. Helicopters scoured highways. Roadblocks were set up across New Jersey, and her name was plastered on every FBI bulletin. But Assata Shakur had disappeared, and she would not be seen on American soil again. The daring escape transformed her from a prisoner into a legend, but also cemented her as one of the most wanted women in America. After her daring escape in 1979, Assata Shakur vanished into the shadows. For years, her whereabouts remained one of America's deepest mysteries. The FBI launched a relentless manhunt, calling her armed and dangerous. Posters with her face, sharp eyes, defiant expression were plastered in post offices across the country. But behind the headlines, Assata was being carefully moved through an underground network of activists and sympathizers. For 4 years, she lived in secrecy, shifting safe houses, using false names, and surviving on the loyalty of those who believed she had been unjustly imprisoned. In 1984, her trail surfaced once more, not in the United States, but in Havana, Cuba. To the shock of U.S. officials, Fidel Castro's government had granted Assata political asylum. Cuba described her as a victim of racial persecution and political targeting in the United States. To the Cuban state, she was a fugitive. She was a freedom fighter, a symbol of resistance against what they saw as American imperialism. In Havana, Assata began a new life. No longer locked in a prison cell, she was free to walk the streets, to breathe, to rebuild. But freedom came with exile. She could never return home. She could never see her family in the U.S. without risking capture. Still, Assata carved out a place for herself. She learned Spanish, taught at local institutions, and raised her daughter Kakuya in relative safety. Though Cuba shielded her, she remained a lightning rod of controversy. Hailed by some as a revolutionary heroine, condemned by others as a convicted cop killer who had evaded justice. The United States government never stopped pursuing her. She was placed on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list, the only woman at the time to be given that designation. A $2 million bounty was offered for her capture, but in Havana, under protection of the Cuban state, Assata Shakur lived beyond the reach of U.S. law. Her exile marked the beginning of a decades-long political standoff, one that would outlive the Cold War and endure long into the 21st century. For decades, Assata Shakur's life in exile became as much about symbolism as survival. In Cuba, she lived quietly, yet her presence cast a long shadow over American politics. She wrote her autobiography, Assata, an autobiography, which offered her own account of her childhood, her activism, her trial, and her escape. For many readers, especially young activists, her story was a revelation, a testimony of struggle, resilience, and defiance against oppression. But for law enforcement, Assata was not a poet of resistance. She was a fugitive, a convicted felon, a woman who, in their eyes, had taken a life and walked away unpunished. Her very existence created a paradox. To some, she was a victim of systemic racism, targeted for daring to stand up against injustice. To others, she was an unrepentant criminal whose supporters had rewritten her into a revolutionary icon. The U.S. government never stopped pressing for her extradition. Presidents and officials across administrations, from Ronald Reagan to Barack Obama, raised the issue with Cuban leaders. Yet Havana stood firm, refusing to send her back. Her death in 2025 at the age of 78 was confirmed by Cuba's foreign ministry. The cause, they said, was natural, the slow decline of age. For some, it marked the closing of a painful chapter. For others, it reopened old wounds. On one side, tributes poured in. Activists, scholars, and community leaders called her a symbol of courage, a woman who had survived brutality, injustice, and political persecution, and still found a way to live and write. On the other, critics reminded the world of Trooper Werner Forster, the man killed on the New Jersey Turnpike in 1973. For his family, justice was never served. For law enforcement, Assata's death in Havana was not closure. It was proof that she had escaped accountability to her very last breath. Her legacy remains divided, split across fault lines of politics, race, and history. Was Assata Shakur a freedom fighter, or was she a fugitive who outmaneuvered justice? The truth lies somewhere between, in the tension between memory and evidence, between narrative and fact, between the America that condemned her and the Cuba that sheltered her. Even in death, Assata Shakur leaves behind a story that cannot be neatly resolved. It is a story of struggle, of loss, of resistance, and of a life that forces us to confront the uncomfortable question of what justice really means.